Hi, my name is Ray.
Hi, this is Michael.
And today we will continue our Ray's Economic Clue book. Today we'll be talking about comparative advantage.
Okay.
So last video we talked about the production possibilities curve or production possibilities frontier, which basically shows how much you as an economy can produce. And we showed it as nonlinear, but for simplicity's sake, in this video we'll show it as linear. So first thing we're going to talk about is absolute advantage. Now absolute advantage is basically the advantage you have when you can produce more of one good compared to another person or another country with the same amount of resources.
Yeah.
So for instance, in here we have country A in the white line and country B in the blue PPC. So country A can produce at the maximum 100 units of rice, while country B can produce at a maximum of 20 units of rice. So of course, obviously, 25 around. So obviously, country A has the absolute advantage in rice by a large margin.
Sure.
And the opposite is true when it looks at iron ore. Country B at the maximum can produce 100 units of iron ore, while country A can produce around 25 units of iron ore.
Sure.
So of course, country B has the absolute advantage in iron ore.
Yeah, I think it's pretty straightforward.
Pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
So now it's where it gets slightly more complex. So next thing is comparative advantage, which was brought up by David Ricardo back in the 1880s. We'll talk about that later. So basically, comparative advantage is basically your opportunity cost of producing a good. And that is when you have a lower opportunity cost, that good is technically cheaper to you. So you have a comparative advantage compared to your opponent or your partner. So you can see here it says it's all about the gradient. What we mean by this is comparative advantage is all about the slope.
All about the opportunity cost.
Slope, because a less steeper slope or a smaller slope represents a smaller opportunity cost, which represents a more likelihood of comparative advantage. So we see here country A has the absolute advantage in both grapes and nuts.
Yeah.
However, it obviously has the lesser slope in nut production. It obviously has a lesser opportunity cost in nuts compared to country B.
Yeah, so that really means that grapes, comparatively speaking, more expensive than nuts for country A.
Yes.
Right?
So because of the country A's lesser opportunity cost for nuts are cheaper comparatively in country A than country B. While country B, comparatively speaking to country A, grapes are cheaper, I suppose, compared because they both have this. It's about the same opportunity cost for both. But compared to country A, grapes are cheaper than country B in terms of opportunity cost.
Sure.
So country B has the comparative advantage in grapes, and country A has a comparative advantage in nuts.
Yeah, so I think that's a great point because if A and B are isolated, they never had any trade, then nothing is going to happen. Okay, but if they have the means to trade, then it becomes a very different story because for country A, all of a sudden they can find actually the price of grape divided by the relative price is different in outside the world, right? From B, right?
Yes.
So for country B, it's the same story. Okay. They find that actually the relative pricing is different outside island B. So they're gonna have an incentive to trade because they're gonna take advantage of the different opportunity cost. Okay, so let's see.
So as Michael here has pretty much implied, comparative advantage is the deciding factor in trade. So basis for trade is basically comparative advantage. Basically, each country produces what it has a comparative advantage in, what is relatively cheaper for each country, and then they trade. So basically, say here, of course, at the end of the day, based off of comparative advantage, more of each good can be consumed by both countries. And so because of this absolute advantage, it becomes irrelevant when it talks about trade.
Yeah, it basically means that the competitive advantage, because of the trade, the production can be, increased. And the consumption can also be, beneficial for both parties.
This is due to both parties producing what is the cheapest relatively for both of them in comparative advantage.
Let's see.
So let's look at an example of this. So we see both JC John and HC Helen. So we see the PPC of Helen in blue and the PPC of John in yellow. Now, John and Helen, if they both just isolated themselves and did not trade, John at most can produce 20 units of coconuts or 10 units of fish. And Helen's the opposite. She either produces at most 10 units of coconut and 0 units of fish, or 20 units of fish and 0 units of coconut. However, if they both traded, we can see that they will both trade what they have a comparative advantage in. In this case, John has a comparative advantage in coconuts, and Helen has a comparative advantage in fish. So they will both trade at the unit of 2020. Because they produce what they're specialized in.
20 coconut, 20 C, and 20 F, right?
Yes, because
fish.
John produces because they both produce what they have a comparative advantage in, and they don't produce the other good, and so this produces us at point T 2020.
Yeah, which means a trade, right? If they want to trade, they can produce based on their specialization.
Yes.
Okay?
So now they both trade. For simplicity, let's say they both trade half of what they produce.
Yeah.
So John trades 10 coconuts for 10 fish.
Yeah.
So he now has 10 coconuts and 10 fish. And Helen trades 10 fish for 10 coconuts. So she also has 10 fish and 10 coconuts and 10 fish.
Mm-hmm.
So that's about right here.
Yeah.
It's about right here.
Actually, on this line.
Yes.
Yeah.
On that line. Let's say it's on that line.
Yeah. So.
So as we see here, this point of production, or more like consumption, is outside both of their PPCs. Yep. Which means technically, they both have technically grown economically by more production.
Yeah. So basically, that really means John and Helen implicitly by trade, their production curve actually move outward.
Yes,
okay.
This is just
TPC, right?
Basically, trade is basically really like economic growth.
Driven by the technology, for example, because in this case, John specializes on coconut, and Helen specializes on fish. So basically, like said, John borrows the technology from Helen in terms of fish.
Yes.
And Helen, of course, borrows technology from John in terms of coconut production. So implicitly by trade, they got as if they got a technology advancement. Advancement in one specialization.
Yes.
Okay. So that's why the trade, the TPC curve here, trade possibility curve is actually outside their own PPC. Okay?
Yes. So as Michael mentioned, trade possibility curves. So basically, with what our previous example of 10 fish and 10 coconuts, this leads us to the interesting trade possibility curve, which is right here, which is the red dotted line.
Yeah. We call that TPC. Okay.
TPC?
Yeah.
Basically, they can both produce up to 20 coconuts and 20 fish together, and they can basically both consume anywhere between those two examples.
Half.
Yes.
For example, that's just for half. But they could trade in different different
yes.
mix.
And all those mixes are represented on the TPC.
So.
And as you'll notice, the TPC is outside both of their individual isolated PPC curves, which further points as evidence that trade is basically like economic growth for both parties.
Yeah. Okay.
So we previously mentioned David Ricardo.
Yeah.
So in the past, because people looked at absolute advantage, they thought that trade was unnecessary in some examples. For instance, as we see here, as we see in the first example, country A has an absolute advantage in basically grapes and nuts. So with that logic, with the old classical logic, country A would not trade.
Yeah, has no reason to trade. Yeah.
But David Ricardo came along and said that this is not true, that the basis of trade should not be absolute advantage. He basically thought of the concept of comparative advantage.
Yeah.
So basically, he thought of specialization, as it proved in the last example with John and Helen. And he said that basically this will create less cost for both parties in a perfectly competitive market with a linear PPF.
He mentioned the importance of the specialization. So implicitly, it's kind of like brings the technology advancement into one party.
Yeah.
Okay? And of course, there's a lot of assumptions based on his theory. For example, he assumes frictionless trade with basically no transaction cost, no trade cost. Okay.
Yes.
And assumes the PPF is linear and it's a perfect competitive market. So it's you can always just you can always trade according to the market price. Okay. So but the core concept is very clear.
Yes.
So the trade creates opportunity for specialization.
Yes.
So you can borrow the more advanced technology from the other party, and so that all parties can actually consume more.
As we saw in the previous example of John Helen and the TPC line, David Ricardo is essentially correct in saying that trade is basically like economic growth, and that it should be based on comparative advantage, not absolute advantage. So for our final clues for you to remember today, basically, as we said before, trade is based on a comparative advantage and what is the relatively cheapest for both parties. And it's not based on absolute advantage. And trade results in the end, as David Ricardo stated, specialization. For instance, John produced coconuts and Helen produced fish. And so specialization leads to both countries or both parties consuming more of all goods traded on the TPC curve.
So that's very important because specialization brings brings implicit technology advancement and brings more consumption for both parties.
Yes.
Okay, so that's a key point for the David Ricardo's theory of trade.
Yes.
So I think that's really great, and I really like that, and I look forward for your next episode.
Thank you.
See you guys.
See you
Bye.
next time.